Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'll be discussing an overlooked driver of decline for many wild animals, and especially arboreal folivores like the greater glider. That is the influence of temperature on food intake. I'll start with some background to this issue and what the research has shown us. Then I'll discuss implications for climate change with a particular focus on the greater glider. I'll review some outstanding questions that we still need to address and finish with the most important thing, all the people who help make this work possible. Here's a question for you. If you're really hungry, which would you prefer to eat? A huge buffet with a vast amount of stomach-filling fare or a small bowl of salad? The big buffet, right? Now I'll ask you the same question again, but first, imagine it's a stinking hot day. You're dripping with sweat and your air conditioner is broken. There's no escaping the heat. Now which meal would you prefer? A huge buffet or a small salad? When I'm feeling really hot, I would much prefer the small salad. If I was really, really hot, I'd also need a lot of water. I might even forgo food entirely and just have water if I could. But why? It turns out that all endotherms, like you and me, eat less as temperatures increase. Endotherms are animals, like mammals and birds, that regulate their temperatures internally. In fact, the relationship between temperature and food intake for these animals is almost continuously negative. In other words, when you're cold, you eat more. When you're hot, you eat less. Eating less allows animals to limit diet-induced thermogenesis, which is the production of heat as a byproduct of the digestion, transport, and storage of nutrients. The exact reasons for this involve a lot of chemistry, and explaining that would take all my presentation time, so I'll keep this simple for now. Eating makes us hot. The relationship between temperature and food intake is a well-known phenomenon in the livestock and poultry industries. Great strides are taken to keep production animals from getting too hot, so they'll produce more and grow faster. After all, if an animal doesn't eat, it won't grow as big as it could, make us eggs or milk. The capacity of endotherms to shed heat generated by metabolic activity ultimately places limits on their intake. Animals can shed heat through physiological mechanisms, primarily sweating, but this is costly too and requires access to water, something that not all of us have in abundance. Interestingly, the interaction between feeding and thermoregulation is often overlooked in wild animals. Here are some ringtail possums overlooking us. How do I know this issue is overlooked for wild animals? Because I'm guilty of it myself, and I've looked. Reduction in voluntary food intake is almost non-existent in the climate change literature for wild animals. A recent review of literature that aimed to predict the responses of wild mammals to climate change acknowledged that access to food and water strongly influence body temperature in mammals, but it didn't recognize that all endotherms limit the amount of food that they eat in response to elevated temperatures. None of the mechanistic or causal models reviewed in that paper, or that we have seen elsewhere, even in the physiology literature for wildlife, attempt to account for lower nutrient and water intake that accompanies reduced food consumption in response to higher ambient temperatures. For an example a bit closer to home, Kearney et al. Used a mechanistic model to predict changes in the distribution of greater gliders under various climate change scenarios. This model did not consider the impacts of temperature on food intake. Instead, feeding rate was assumed to be constant throughout the night. As a result, the potential consequences of elevated nighttime temperature on greater glider persistence in southeastern Australia were not recognized. Why is this so absent from wild animal studies? Well, studies of energetics and metabolism in wild animals are almost always conducted on fasted animals, because diet-induced thermogenesis is a well-known significant contributor to metabolic rate. Studying fasted animals removes the source of variation and the costs of digestion on the measure of basal metabolism. While this approach provides a rich data set for comparative analysis, it obscures the fundamental way that changes in food intake are used to regulate heat production in unfasted and free-living animals. So most wildlife researchers aren't even aware of this. Basically, unless you're a farmer, you probably haven't thought about how heat impacts food intake. However, we know this is happening in wild animals because we've seen it in our lab at ANU. This is a graph illustrating how exposure to different ambient temperatures impacts food intake in ringtail possums. The figure on the right shows food intake at 10 degrees, 18 degrees, and 26 degrees. The food is eucalypt leaf that either has high or low concentrations of a naturally occurring eucalypt toxin. We expected intake to decrease at higher temperatures in the more toxic leaf because of something called temperature-dependent toxicity. Basically, the hotter it is, the harder it is for your body to break down toxins. However, we were surprised to see a reduction of food intake happen so dramatically in food that was much more palatable and less toxic. The high temperature in this experiment was just 26 degrees. That surprised us too. Pip, the PhD student who conducted these feeding experiments in temperature-controlled rooms at ANU, planned to have a low, medium, and high temperature. The high temperature was supposed to be in the low 30s, but at 27 degrees, these animals just laid on their backs and panted most of the time. So 26 was a safe upper limit for these feeding studies. That brings me to my next question. What is hot for an animal? Animals eat less as temperature increases, but the rate of change and the sensitivity of animals to heat is very species specific. Some animals obviously tolerate hotter temperatures better than others. Something called thermal neutral zone, or the T&Z, can help us understand what's hot for animals. The T&Z can shift to the right or the left depending on the species. It's the temperature at which an animal's metabolism is the lowest. It's an animal's happy place. The lower critical temperature and the upper critical temperature aren't the limit of thermal tolerance, but they do reflect the point at which metabolic rate increases as animals have to work harder to maintain their own body temperature. Here I've overlaid that reduction of food intake again on the conceptual model. The problem comes when an animal is using more energy than it's able to gain because it can't eat as much as it's expending. For some animals like us, we have a lot of energy reserves, so that's okay for a while. As long as we have access to water so we can sweat, we can actually go many days or even weeks without food. Many animals don't have those kind of energy reserves though. So who is particularly at risk? Animals who derive most of their water from their food because they have to eat to stay hydrated so they can sweat or pant to cool themselves. These animals might not have access to free water because they live in deserts or at the tops of trees. Animals that have diets high in fiber and low in available nutrients, so that covers most leaf-eating animals. The reason is because diets high in fiber and low in available nutrients like carbohydrates, proteins, and fat don't allow you to store a lot of energy. That means you can't go very long between meals. It's also bad news if you have to eat at a certain time. That means no matter what the temperature or environmental conditions, you have a set time you have to eat. You can't wait for a different time or day or night. It's now or never. It's even worse if the food you eat also has toxins. Remember, if it's hot, you're going to have a harder time metabolizing those toxins, and some of them even produce their own heat, like capsaicin, a secondary compound in hot chili peppers, or even worse, some of these plant toxins, like caffeine, are diuretics and cause you to lose precious water that you need to stay cool. So water derived from food, diet high in fiber and low in available nutrients, few energy reserves, restricted time for feeding, consumption of thermodisruptive PSMs. Does this sound like anyone you know? The greater glider. Unfortunately, the greater glider has every one of these risk categories. The metabolic rate of greater gliders, P volens, is lowest at about 20 degrees Celsius. Above 20 degrees, energy demands increase, but food intake likely decreases, as we've seen in ringtail possums and other animals, meaning that these animals must draw on their energy stores. But due to the low energy content of eucalypt leaves and the metabolic demands of detoxifying eucalypt secondary toxins, greater gliders have very few energy reserves. Previous research has shown that fasting for more than one night can be fatal. Without food, water intake is also curtailed, and this hinders the main mechanism for active cooling, which is evaporative water loss. Simply losing your appetite when you're hungry can be fatal for animals like the greater glider. The lethal effects can be acute, where loss of energy or dehydration in the short or longer term causes death, or subacute where reproductive fitness is reduced and population declines follow. What kind of patterns are we seeing in greater gliders that might be related to this common but overlooked response to warming temperatures? As we know, greater glider populations are declining in many areas, and there have been localized extinctions. Ben Wagner and collaborators found that greater glider declines in Victoria were associated with an increase in nighttime temperatures over 20 degrees Celsius. Those hot nights are happening more often. Elevated temperatures from climate change were implicated in greater glider disappearance from lower elevation sites than the Blue Mountains. Those lower elevation sites would have been the hotter sites compared to the higher elevations. And unusually high nighttime temperatures, overnight minimums of 27 degrees, were also observed before their disappearance from Buteri National Park in 2007. However, until now, no mechanism to explain these patterns has been proposed. We know that logging, wildfire, and habitat loss are key drivers of decline. We can now add elevated temperatures to the reasons for this. The most likely process behind the pattern is that these animals are getting hot, eating less, and as a consequence, failing to meet their energy or water requirements. That's all rather depressing. So let's take a break for a moment and look at these cute crater gliders. I don't understand how something like this actually exists. It's like a Jim Henson character. It's really wonderful. All right, now that we've had a breather, what are we going to do about it? Not the cuteness, but the heat. Short of stopping climate change immediately, there are a few more questions we need to answer so we can find the best way to respond. Does better quality food or wetter food help greater gliders overcome hot nights by making the most out of what they can eat? And the opposite, do less nutritious or drier leaves increase susceptibility to thermal stress? How variable is sensitivity to thermal stress within and between populations? And what mechanisms drive that variability? How do thermal and dietary constraints combine to limit habitat and influence refugia? Both microclimates and nutrition tend to be patchy in a landscape. Identifying the best quality habitat from a thermal and nutritional perspective will be key. Are there things we can do to improve the thermal properties of forests to help create cooler microclimates? Early research suggests that there are. Perhaps not surprisingly, logging makes forest microclimates hotter. So yet another reason we need to stop that. Can we make nest boxes that provide some refuge from the heat with thoughtful engineering? A few degrees could make a huge difference. So in summary, heat-stressed animals eat less, but this is often overlooked in wild animals. Now that our eyes are open to it, we realize that many animals rarely considered susceptible to climate change, such as nocturnal folivores, are in fact at risk. And nighttime is heating up faster than the daytime. This is a problem. However, resolving our outstanding questions will help us identify climate change refugia so we can improve and protect it. I'd like to take a moment to give a shout out to nutritional ecology. Nutrition is often overlooked in wildlife conservation and management, but it can help us understand some of the processes behind the patterns we see. When we understand these processes, we can work out ways to do something about them, and our conservation efforts are more targeted to the things that really matter. Last but not least, a big thank you. This work was made possible by so many people doing cool things together. Here are some of them, particularly Bill Foley and David Lindenmeyer, Karen Ford, Pip Beal, Denise McGregor, our university, ANU, the Research School of Biology and the Finner School, the Australian Research Council, Victorian government, so many helpful volunteers, and super helpful statisticians without whom we wouldn't be able to make sense of our data. And the greater gliders in eucalypt forests for providing a lifetime of inspiration to all of us, I think I can safely say. And lastly, to the Symposium for the invitation to present, and to you for listening. Thank you.